Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining us out there. On behalf of Freie Universität Berlin, on behalf of the FUBiS and FUBiS programs, the two sponsoring programs, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session of Berlin Talks. Berlin Talks is a series of presentations on timely topics with a variety of experts providing commentary and giving you, the audience, an opportunity through the chat function to submit questions. Just a quick word about the two sponsoring programs. The FUBiS program, at which I serve as academic director, is a semester-based program on European studies here at Freie Universität Berlin with international students participating. And the same is true for FUBiS, also international students who participate in the summer and winter university program, FUBiS, that offers a session in January and two during the summer. We also have elaborate online offerings right now due to the pandemic. And so we invite you to go to our home pages to find all the material about the programs and about the online offerings that we currently have. Today, our topic is going to be the US elections that just concluded or seem to not quite have concluded because they still linger on in terms of debate and recounts and so on and so forth. All that will be covered tonight, but we will also take a broader view with our panel and consider the background factors, what has been happening in the United States over the last years to come to this moment that so many people would see as a dysfunctional moment in American democracy. What are the implications? What legacy will the Trump presidency have? What are the prospects for the Biden administration? So there's going to be a variety of topics that we are going to address tonight. As I said, you can submit questions through chat. It would also be nice if you just drop us a line and tell us where you are so that we have an idea where on Earth, literally, you are watching us and participating in this event. Also, I should add that this event is recorded, but your identity as audience member is hidden, so that will not be part of the recording. But we have a YouTube channel on which this event can also later in its entirety be watched again. Let me then, at this point, introduce our panel members. We have 5 panel members, 4 of whom are here in the chambers, the plenary chamber of the Academic Senate of Freie Universität, and 1 is at a remote location and is joining us from there. And I'll start with him. That is Professor Dr. Christian Lammert. He is Professor of North American Politics and Policy at the John F. Kennedy Institute here at Freie Universität Berlin. He got his PhD at the Goethe-Universität in Frankfurt, and among his specialties, his research areas are social policy in the United States and the politics of healthcare in the US. Also coming to us from the John F. Kennedy Institute at Freie Universität Berlin is Professor Dr. Lora Anne Viola. She got her PhD from the University of Chicago. She also has been a senior research fellow at the Berlin Social Science Research Center and a visiting scholar at Stanford and Oxford University. And she is, by the way, a native New Yorker and an adopted Berliner, and her area of specialty is US foreign and security policy, among others. The third person joining us today from the John F. Kennedy Institute is Professor Dr. Max Steinhardt, who received his doctorate in economics from the University of Hamburg, and his primary research interests are labor economics, political economy, the economics of migration, and US economic policy. So those are 3 faculty members of the John F. Kennedy Institute joining us. Then in addition, joining us is Dr. Klaus Shariat, who is Professor of Practice at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in the US and Dean of the Mercator Fellowship on International Affairs here in Germany. He was a member of the German Foreign Service for more than 35 years, from 1976 to 2011, and from 2006 to 2011, he was a German ambassador in Washington. And from 2002 to 2006, he was state secretary in the German Foreign Office. He also had many other assignments. I won't list them all here, but among them were director of the private office of the NATO Secretary General. He has a German law degree and a doctorate and additional degrees from the Fletcher School in Boston, Cambridge, Boston. And joining us is Ms. Katrin Bennhold. She is a journalist. She works for the New York Times and leads their New York Times Berlin bureau. Her areas of interest are nationalism and populism in Europe, but also topics ranging from migration to gender. She has been with the New York Times since 2004 and has a master's degree in economics from the London School of Economics. She also was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University in 2012 and 2013. So I welcome our guests, our panelists for tonight, and we want to start here with some background analysis and have some input from our panel on this. The US is in a very turbulent mode, in a very turbulent mood right now. After this election, but also before, the last 4 years seem to have been very turbulent. And so one of the questions that emerges, focused of course on the person of Trump, is to what extent Trump is the cause of a lot of this turbulence, or to what extent the phenomenon of Trump is the result of developments in American politics, in American society, in American economic conditions and so on. So is he a cause or is he a result of this? And with that, I would probably ask, perhaps based on seniority, our long-term observer of things American, Klaus Shariat, to give us his impressions on this question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. And thank you also for the question. I would say both. It is a result of what had happened before in the United States, but I would say Trump really strengthened that movement and reinforced it. I think it began already of late in 2010 with the Tea Party movement, which had already very similar objectives, but without a charismatic figure as Donald Trump. And you might say about him whatever you want, but he is certainly a charismatic man. And without this charismatic capabilities of a Donald Trump, who knows TV perfectly, who knows everything about the news cycle. I mean, that you post a tweet at 5:30 in the morning and not in the evening, all that he knows. And therefore, I would say, without him, it would never have been as strong as it is.
Thank you. Let's get a journalist perspective. Ms. Bennhold, what do you say to this question? You have observed the US. Is Trump something that was bound to happen, or has he shaped the dynamics and the atmosphere?
Thank you very much. And I'm also very happy to be here. It's a very distinguished panel and obviously a very exciting moment in international politics. I agree with Mr. Shariat. I think it's a mixture of both. To me, I would say that having observed populists and autocrats in Europe and populist parties even here in Germany, that Trump was kind of a symptom of something that was happening across Western democracies. I would say that he is both something very American and something that speaks to a malaise that is Western right now, and the malaise of Western liberal democracy. So I would split it into parts. I would say the structural deep reasons that we need to deal with are, one, a particular moment in America where America's heading for a situation where minorities become the majority. In fact, in certain age groups, that's already happened. And I feel what we're seeing right now, and we saw it with the Black Lives Matter sort of protests this year and situation this year unfold in America, I feel that this is a fight for history. This is a fight for democracy. And Trump, in that sense, is a legacy of Obama as the first Black president of the United States. He represents that backlash, the white supremacist backlash, if you like, but also the fear of hard done by white Americans to a certain degree. I think there's an important second part to this, which is broader and goes beyond the United States. And that is that there's been kind of 2 decades of crumbling trust in liberal democracy, which has to do with some real grievances. And I think it's something that we in Germany and across Europe need to look at very seriously too. It's the fact that many voters have the feeling that whoever's in power, whether they're center left or center right, broadly drives the same policies, that there's no real policy invention, there's no real new solutions and sort of blue sky thinking out there. They feel particularly betrayed, in my experience, interviewing people by the center left, because traditionally the center left says that it has the back of the people. And so the people feel more betrayed by the center left. So in some sense, I feel that those who went out in the working class sort of areas of America. And, that's not to say that Trump was voted in just by working class left-hand Americans. I know that there's a big sort of economic vote there too. But those people felt betrayed by Obama, who in that sense didn't represent the Black president, but more a Democratic Party that had moved very far away from its base. I feel like there are lessons here for the SPD in Germany and for basically social democrats across Western democracies. I would say those 2 elements, the kind of multi-ethnic democracy, where are we going to go from here? And liberal democracy, how can we make sure that liberal democracy and capitalism deliver again for voters? I think those 2 things are the big questions of our time. And we've just won ourselves a 4-year reprieve to figure it out.
Thank you. That's really interesting because it already starts to bring in the European dimension here, of course, to this issue, trying to not isolate Trump to just an American phenomenon that is part of something broader. Professor Lammert, we're going to try to bring you in. You are the remote location, but visible to us and hopefully also to the audience. You're a keen observer of American society. What societal dynamics do you see at play here when it comes to the Trump phenomenon and everything that's associated with it?
First of all, thank you for inviting me and for tuning me in from my remote home here in Frankfurt am Main. I'm in a sabbatical right now, writing a book on the crisis of democracy. What I'm thinking, what we should add to what is already said, are 2 crises in a way. One is a depolarization of the society in the United States. In the society and especially at the political elite level, leading to some form of gridlock in the political system, so that the system is not delivering anymore the results that the people expect. And we can see that trust in political institution is declining massively as a result of this gridlock. And talking about polarization, I guess that is important that both parties, and especially the Republican Party, has moved massively to the right. And this is what we see right now, that Trump was able to mobilize on those move to the right, and in a way captured the Republican Party. And the second crisis, I guess, that we need to address in order to understand the Trump phenomena is an economic crisis, and that's a massive increase in income and wealth inequality that we have seen in the United States over the last 3-4 decades. Here, more and more people don't see the economic system is delivering any kind of benefits for them anymore. And I guess a good example to describe this is Trump is always making the argument the economy is going great. And he looks at the stock market, and that's true. This is a phenomenal development if we look at the stock market in the United States, but you need to take into account that the stock market is maybe for the top 10% in the income distribution. That's the people working with money on the stock market. Whereas at the same time, you see a lot of people who live from paycheck to paycheck and having problems to get food on the table. So I guess that's a polarization and massive income inequality and wealth income inequality that we need to add to the story in order to understand why people are so upset sometimes with established political actors and institutions, and we're open for voting for an outsider like Donald Trump.
Thank you very much. Let me pick up on the last segment of your answer, which dealt with economics, and go to Dr. Max Steinhardt. Are some of those economic dynamics purely American, or are we also talking about something that is happening in the Western world as a whole, that then again, going back to what Ms. Bennhold said about the dynamics in Europe, that also impact things in other countries? How do you see that from an economist point of view? You need to.
Yeah, I agree to what Ms. Bennhold said. We're living in a globalized world, and what we see also in Europe is that we have populist leaders who raise concerns about two things. Globalization is characterized by mobility of goods, which is trade, and mobility of people, which is migration. And these populist leaders, like, for example, also Boris Johnson or Marine Le Pen in Europe, they do something similar like Donald Trump. They are sensitive in a way that they see that many people are concerned about this globalization, and some people experience or expect to be in a worse position than before because of the trade and because of the migration. And they use these concerns and worries of the people to mobilize voters and to amplify the concerns of the people. And so far, I'm totally on the same page like Ms. Bennhold, that Trump has, of course, a number of features which are typical for America, but he's also in a way very similar to the European populists that we see nowadays. And therefore, he's using concerns about economic factors to mobilize people. And when the question, the beginning, you asked a question whether he's cause or result, I would agree to Mr. Shariat, both, right? Of course, there were existing patterns of polarization existing since many years, and without these patterns, which were also addressed by Christian Lammert, it would have not have been possible to get him elected and that he became a president. But on the other hand, he was amplifying, of course, many things, and he had a very negative impact on many dimensions. So therefore, definitely, I would say also agree to the question and say he's both cause and result.
Thank you. Let's switch for a moment here now with Professor Viola to the foreign policy dimension. To what extent is hidden also in this question of the phenomenon Trump, the question about what is the role of the United States in the world? Trump, make America great again, sort of America first, not a new phenomenon in American history, of course. Also, yeah, echoing the past of isolationism, perhaps even. What is the foreign policy dimension of this Trump phenomenon? Is that something that, again, Trump is simply giving a voice to, or has he also himself created a particular foreign policy environment? How do you see that?
Yes, thank you also from my side for inviting me here to speak today. So these are all fantastic questions that have lots of different dimensions to them. Just to pick up on the cause or effect question, I wanted to add that it's important to note that the polarization that we see in the United States has much longer, deeper roots than Trump, or even than just the last 4 years or the last decade. It's a decades-long process that has been ongoing, and in that sense, certainly Trump has amplified many of the the negative partisanship and the polarization we see, but he's also the product of attempts by the parties to mobilize voters by moving to the extremes and hollowing out the middle. And I think what you see in foreign policy terms is an interesting convergence of polarization dynamics domestically and what I would call an anxiety about America's decline in the world that is a little bit more recent. It's probably an anxiety that really took hold after 9/11. So the United States, of course, was the victor at the end of the Cold War in the 90s, seems now to be a period of, of almost a paradise of international relations where the United States was the sole major power and could determine the course of events. And after 9/11, what you see is that the United States became involved in a number of conflicts with no clear strategy for extracting itself from those conflicts or resolving those conflicts. And at the same time, you see really at the 2001, 2002, a shift away from the United States towards emerging powers, and in particular, the rise of China. And this anxiety over the relative decline of the United States is something that the past few administrations have tried to come to terms with, but haven't really figured out how. And I think that you saw that in Obama's administration, and he had, for example, tried strategies like lead from behind, right, to allow allies to take a more greater leadership role in foreign policy. You see the pivot to Asia as another strategy of his to try to recalibrate American foreign policy in this changed landscape with a power shift. And I think that to some extent, America First is also a reaction to how does the United States position itself in a landscape, a geopolitical landscape where you see a shift in the distribution of power. And I think that the United States still hasn't figured it out. And but Trump has done two, I think, really interesting things that are going to be important for the future of U.S. foreign policy. The first is that he has really put the idea of the retrenchment of the United States on the table. So, he's been highly criticized for arguing that NATO is obsolete, but he has put that option on the table where it wasn't an option for mainstream politics before. And he's put the idea that the United States maybe shouldn't be militarily as involved around the world on the table. And that's an idea that is of interest not just for Trump supporters from the right, but also for many progressive Democrats. And the second thing that he's done to change the discourse on American foreign policy is that he has freed the Republicans from the mantra of free trade. And that has opened up a policy space also for progressive Democrats to critique globalization and free trade. So these are, I think, two long-lasting changes that will be central to the United States' internal debate about how to recalibrate its role in the world, given the power shifts that have been happening and that have structural reasons that go, way beyond Trump and what he's done in the last 4 years.
Thank you very much. Several of the points that were made here, our audience will notice. They will come back because later on we are going to look at the prospects for the Biden administration. And of course, Biden is going to inherit a particular environment domestically and internationally. And the question is going to be, is there going to be a return to certain things that supposedly were there beforehand? Or is Biden going to be forced to deal with a legacy and a set of circumstances that are really definitely now different? But before we do that, we're going to turn now in our next segment to the campaign that just ended and to the dynamics of the election. And as we get into that, we're going to project to you a few maps and pieces of information. And we will start with what we internally call here B1, which is the final ratings of the crystal ball that Larry Sabato and his colleagues at the Center for Politics at the University of Virginia have. And there you see it here now. There was a lot of discussion about how the polling was off again and so on. And here you see what was projected as the last rating, so to speak, of this institute. And if we then go to the next map, we see basically the outcome with, of course, North Carolina and Georgia in this particular rendition still shaded, but of course now also pretty much settled. And actually, when one compares these projections and the way the map turned out, it wasn't that far off. One can go in the internet and look at various kinds of projections. In terms of the Electoral College lineup of the states, most of the final projections that were serious were actually on the mark. The margin of victory might be bigger or smaller, and surprisingly smaller or bigger in some states. But much of, basically all of that, what is blue there, was projected to be blue, and what was projected to be red turned out to be red. We can keep going to the third in the sequence. One more, and that is the control of the Senate. And there we see that what is, with some exceptions going on here, is that there's an overlap there with the Electoral College. That most of the states that are blue tend to be also blue in terms of the senators. And most of the states that tend to be red in terms of senatorial control. Okay, we want to show a few more things, and then I get to some questions for our panel. We will go to the next slide, and this gets at the issue of the Electoral College and the popular vote. One of the big debates, of course, ongoing in the United States is the fact that the Electoral College supposedly favors the Republican Party. And here you see a research project that shows that the Republicans have a much higher chance of winning the Electoral College while still losing the popular vote. And if you see the development over time, you see that as the gap that develops basically between the probability of Republican winning while losing the popular vote and Democrat winning. We go a little further still, a couple more things to show. It's very interesting when you ask people in the United States what they think about this. Shouldn't the Constitution be amended, the Electoral College abolished, so that you just simply do the popular vote count? At the beginning of this year, close to 60% of the population in this particular survey suggested, yeah, that should be changed. But then if you look at the bottom and you look at it in terms of those that are Republican or leaning Republican versus Democrat, you see the Democrats very well sense that the Electoral College may be a disadvantage to them, whereas the Republicans may see an advantage in it and don't really want to change. A couple more things that we're going to show you. Voter turnout is often a big issue as well. We just want to show you a little comparison here. Recent elections, the United States, an estimated 65% turnout. So you can see it lined up to a number of other Western or democracies, plus Israel and South Korea. And then we will go a little further. The turnout rate since 1900. So you can see a little development there, how it has declined for much of the 20th century and now seems to be increasing again. That may be a good sign for the health of democracy, that more people turn out to vote. A couple more things we're going to show you here. The turnout by race, Black, white, other, Hispanic. You can see how that develops over time. A relatively strong growing tendency among Black voters to turn out. Of course, that also had to do with the Obama years. But you can see a bit of a difference there among the various ethnic groups. And we have the next one, and it looks at age. We'll have to see how that worked in terms of age. There was, of course, a lot of mail ballot voting and so on, particularly those that are older because of the pandemic situation. But you can get a sense of voter turnout. One of the things that is always of concern in the US and perhaps in some other countries as well is the relatively low propensity of younger voters to turn out compared to many other groups. So we're going to go around again with our panel here to look at the election campaign, to analyze that. It sometimes is argued that Trump had 3 opponents in the election campaign? A, himself, B, the pandemic and the economic fallout because of it, and thirdly, Joe Biden. And not necessarily in that sequence of importance, but having lived through this election campaign, observed it, let's start with Klaus Shariat. Give us your reflections on what we have seen happening in the US in this campaign.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Before I come to that, I would like to add one point to our previous round, because I agree with whatever all of you said. I think that was all correct. But I would add one point, and that is a reason which, in my view, made Trump only possible, and that's the development of the media. When I first came to the United States 50 years ago, everybody watched Walter Cronkite, and everybody had the same set of news, the same set of facts. Nowadays, because we have now cable TV and we have MSNBC, which caters to the left-leaning public, and we have Fox News, more to the right, and we have Sinclair News, which is closely to Fox. And I think Donald Trump would not have been possible with the old CBS, NBC, ABC media network. Because whatever he says, all the fake news, all the not really facts, they are repeated and not questioned by Fox News, by Sinclair News, which is as powerful as Fox News, and also by Rush Limbaugh on radio. And also social media come to that. I don't want to prolong that too much, but I think that's very important to understand, that a person like Donald Trump would not have been possible without the TV situation in the United States. And let me add one last sentence. I'm very glad that we have public radio and TV in Germany. To your questions, I think himself, was it the pandemic or was it Joe Biden? I think the second reason is not a reason. I was very much amazed when I looked at the exit polls, and 87% of those people who voted for Trump said that he handled the crisis brilliantly. 87%, which is not the perception we had here from Europe or from Germany. So I think the pandemic, much to my astonishment, didn't play a role in the election. What did play a role, I think, is the personality of Donald Trump. And Biden, I would say, a lesser role. I think Biden only in this regard that he is the anti-type for Donald Trump. He's an honest man, he can be trusted, he's decent, and the exact opposite of Donald Trump. I think in reality, it was an election about Donald Trump. It was, I talk regularly with friends over the United States, Republicans and Democrats, and the Republicans said, yeah, Donald Trump is unfairly treated and we have to back him up. Whereas those who did not vote for Donald Trump, who voted for Biden, they all deeply resented Trump. They felt that democracy was endangered and that if Donald Trump would be re-elected, there would be a constitutional crisis in the United States. So I think only the first of your three possibilities really played a role. It was a vote on Donald Trump.
We go to the New York Times point of view, or the New York Times point of view. What do you say to this?
I like the very predictable symmetry of this discussion. So I would say that, to me, the most striking thing, and I have to say I was watching this election from this side of the Atlantic, although, of course, I'm in contact with my colleagues in the US. And one thing I heard them say was that they felt like foreign correspondents in their own country, which pretty much says it all. The extreme polarization, which was pointed out, I think, by Mr. Lammert in the first round, was very, very visible on the ground. And, you know, we kind of analyzed the reasons why somebody like Trump could be elected, and everybody agreed that he exacerbated the situation. I mean, the very real and, to me, most profound manifestation of this in this campaign was the sort of brazenness of the lies that are still circulating and that have led to a situation where almost half the country might feel that this election was stolen from them. And I think it's really important for people in the liberal bubble to understand that that is what people are actually feeling. They are not pretending to feel this. They are not, saying this because Trump is saying this. They actually believe that this democracy is betraying them. And that's only possible because they've been lied to before over many, many decades. I mean, you can go back a long way, and we have done in the first round. I mean, whether it's the lies that allowed the Bush administration to go to war in Iraq, whether it is the fact that people were sold mortgages that ended up going bad, and then they saw the sort of criminal banks that had sold them mortgages be bailed out with their own taxpayers' money. I mean, that is the situation on the basis of which these kind of lies today fall on fertile ground. The brazenness of these lies and the destructive nature of them, nevertheless, I think is to me the most shocking takeaway from this election, because a very great chunk of the American population today does not believe that democracy is real. And a democracy is only ever as good and strong as the trust in it. So this is the work that has to happen. And maybe throwing forward a tiny bit, the worry that I have looking forward now is that, yes, we have 4 years to address this, but it has to be a truly transformative presidency to address these deep-seated problems, both of trust and of economic inequalities, as Mr. Lammert mentioned. It requires not just the sort of vision that you need for that, but then it needs a political system that allows you to do that. And I'm sure we'll talk more about the Senate and other sort of limitations. But to me, this polarization that has resulted in a situation where perhaps almost as many as half of the Americans believe that democracy has failed them, that to me is the tragedy of the situation, really.
Thank you. I want to go to Max Steinhardt with this issue of the campaign. Many of us may remember the Clinton campaign. It's the economy, stupid. That was the big slogan at that time that helped him, of course, overcome Bush Sr., a similar situation, who then became a one-term president. In this situation, the pandemic caused, of course, a huge economic downturn. What is your perception of the election campaign that took place? Was it a factor, or how did people calculate that into their choices? What was your observation of the economic dimension of the campaign?
You mentioned this famous quote, and there are many empirical papers in econ research that show for the past that it's true. And I'm pretty convinced that it is also true in this case. So of course we don't have a counterfactual, so we do not know what would have happened without this massive recession, which is still ongoing in the US. But I'm pretty sure that without the recession, Trump would have won for real. Not he's still claiming it, but he would really have won the election. And Christian Lambert was making the argument that Trump is always using the stock markets as an argument that the economy is doing well. And of course, he was also doing this during in his campaign. But when you look at the real numbers, right, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, they initiated a new indicator which allows to have an actual view of the economy, and so it's the weekly economic index. It combines 10 daily and weekly indicators on real economic activity. And when you look on this, you see that there was a very, very strong downturn and decline, much harder than in the last big recession. And the recovery is ongoing, but we are far away from a recovery. So it's a process which is still ongoing. And it's pretty unclear what the next steps will be, or whether the recovery will continue or not, because the infection scenario or the infections are not under control. And Joe Biden made it clear that he will follow a different strategy in fighting the virus. So, of course, a national shutdown is the last resort, but he made clear that he wants more testing and more control measures in place. So it's the latest figures for the last quarter are not out yet, So depending on this and on the measures which are taken, it might also happen that we have no recovery in the next month, right? And also in the next year there might be a zero growth. So it's totally unclear what happens. And I'm pretty you showed us the numbers, right? It was pretty narrow, and is the popular vote not, but in the swing states it was pretty close. So I believe that without this COVID-driven recession, Trump would have won.
Before I turn to Professor Lammert, I want to ask my technical colleagues to show us slide B10, because there was already some comments made about how divided the US and how divided also the response was of voters to the two candidates. And here what we want to show you is a brief overview of who voted for Biden. If we can have that shown here. There we go. And what you can see there, what is an interesting contrast if you look at white men versus black women voters, for example. 93% of black women voters going for Biden, but only 39% of white men. So the white population in the US very much divided, where Biden would have to be lucky to get close to 40%. But then looking at the African-American vote, where, by the way, Clinton did much more poorly in comparison. She did get a massive majority, but not quite the 90%. And also the turnout was lower among black voters 4 years ago. Asian voters as well, a very high percentage. So again, a tendency for the Democrats to attract more of the minority vote. 60% roughly of the younger vote. That's also not that huge of a gap, because that still means that close to 40% went for Trump. Let's turn to Professor Lammert. When you look at this campaign, you already heard some of the other comments. What are some of the things that stand out to you when we analyze this campaign now, looking back? The dynamics, the issues, the strategies used, the points made, the role of the media. What are some of the things that you take away from this campaign?
Well, I guess looking at the media and how polarized the public debate in the United States is, I guess this is one of the reasons that it's so hard to make any kind of predictions. Because in some cases and in some of the discussions, you really see two groups totally disconnected from each other. It was already mentioned that Trump voters were thinking that Trump was doing a great job in the COVID pandemic. If you look at what is going on right now, nearly 77% of Republicans believe that this election was rigged. Whereas nearly no Democrat is thinking that the election is rigged. So we have really two groups with their own media environment, not just TV channels, but also social media, that live in filter bubbles that are completely disconnected to each other. And this is, I guess, one of the problems that we have also seen during the election campaign. There were two alternatives in this campaign. There was Biden taking the COVID pandemic very serious, wearing a mask, hiding in his basement. That was the criticism that the Trump campaign was doing. You can also call it social distancing. And Trump running when it was possible, a regular campaign with campaign events that were hotspots for this pandemic. And I guess there was a real alternative, but without any large effects on the voter. What we see in the United States is that the group of the independent voters is getting smaller and smaller. We have hardcore Republicans, we have hardcore Democrats, and we have leaning Republicans and leaning Democrats. In political science, we sometimes call this tribalism. Negative partisanship. You never would vote or support the other candidate. It's just about mobilization. And we have seen, and this is, we talked about this, a record participation, a record voting turnout. And I guess this is partly a result of the politicization of nearly everything in this polarized context that mobilized a lot of voters on both sides. Biden was very successful. I guess he will get over the 18 million voter threshold. These are the most votes that ever went for a presidential candidate in the history of the United States. But also Trump was very successful in mobilizing new voters. And I guess this was also part of the reasons why some of the public opinion polls were maybe not that accurate, because this is something that you cannot calculate into your samples. New voters that haven't shown up before. But I think what is interesting, if we look at the exit polls that you just showed on the slide, we need to compare it to the exit polls of 2016 to see any kind of trends. And what we see is that Biden was winning among white men, also white men with no college degree. So this is part of this Rust Belt story, that the Democrats were able to win back part of this labor movement votes in those areas. And the bad news for the Democrats have been that they were losing massively with Latino men and Latina women. This was a big surprise, and this is why Florida went again to Donald Trump. So we see a lot of movement in those voter coalition going on, and this is also one of the reasons why it's hard to predict election outcome right now, because demographic is changing massively in the United States, people moving around, young people getting more important, and this narrative that minorities automatically vote for the Democratic Party, I guess, is just partly true.
Thank you. I want to pick up one theme out of the campaign that did not really get a lot of attention, although it was an issue before, during the Trump years, and that was immigration. In the 2018 midterm elections, that was a bigger issue. Dr. Steinhardt, you also are interested in the interplay of economics and migration and immigration. Was it the pandemic that basically overshadowed everything else and so caused immigration not to be a factor? How do you see that issue playing out in this election year?
Thank you. That's a very good question. Yes, indeed. Migration was in this campaign not such a big topic like in the campaign before. And I think one reason for this was definitely the COVID pandemic and the recession caused by it. And another reason is that in a way he delivered what he promised, right? So he delivered to be very strict and tough on migration, and he was. So it was not a topic which he could use again to mobilize, right? And therefore, I think it played not such an important role in this campaign. And on the other hand, he need to be careful because he was in a way learning his lesson from the last election. Okay, in the last election, he was losing a lot of votes, or he had very little support from Hispanics, right? And also among Afro-Americans. And as Christian Lammert just pointed out, this time he was more successful, right? And he would have been not so successful if he would have played again the migration card so tough like last time. So I think these are two explanations for this pattern that you just described.
Thank you. Yes, we're going to turn to Professor Viola, who wants to say something in response to some of the others. And let me just pose my question so you can wrap it all together. Where was foreign policy in this campaign? It normally does not play a big role unless there's a war going on or something, really significant. But it didn't seem to have any impact. Your take on the campaign, please.
Everyone has said the Democrats and the Republicans knew that this would be an election that would be decided on turnout. And, for the reasons that Professor Lammert already said, the electorate is highly polarized. There are very few undecided voters. But I think that there is, negative partisanship has been very effective at mobilizing voters. The COVID crisis and the particular polarization of this presidency also motivated a lot of voters to go out and vote, as we've seen in the statistics. But I think that there is a danger of overestimating the role of mobilization here. And I think that this is one of the lessons that the Democrats will need to take away from this election, and that is that persuasion still matters. And you see it in, there's no complacency, there's no room for complacency for Democrats to think that they will just naturally get minority votes. And, as has been said, we saw that in Florida with Hispanics, we saw that with Black voters, particularly Black men. And we saw that also with white voters, white male voters. And I think that one of the lessons that the Democrats will have to take away from this election is that they will need to not just run against candidates and mobilize their electorate through negative partisanship, but find ways to persuade voters to vote for them. In particular, given the demographic changes that we're seeing in the United States right now, because there is a part of the electorate that's up for grabs, and they need to be won over. We can't just assume that they're going to vote for one party or the other. And I think that in this respect, the Democrats are facing a challenge because they're not really entirely clear what their message is, right? So the Republicans had the advantage that Trump just took over the messaging of the Republican Party and the Republicans fell into line. The Democrats, on the other hand, they're split between a more centrist, moderate view of the party and a more progressive, liberal view of the party. And we see that with AOC's remarks also in the last few days. We see that with the split between Bernie Sanders and Biden. But this is a generational divide in the Democratic Party, and there's going to be some struggle over how to get the messaging out to persuade the number of voters that they need to actually win elections. So I think that we can't just focus on mobilization like has been really the centerpiece of the argument for the last few years. On foreign policy is traditionally not an important topic for voters. They are mobilized and motivated by what really hits them at home, and that's in particular the economy. And I would have to agree that I think COVID played an enormously important role because in the absence of the pandemic, I think I agree with Max Steinhardt that Trump would have won on the basis of the economy. We had historic low levels of unemployment in the United States, and manufacturing jobs saw modest but still an increase in wages under Trump. And so those are the issues that people vote on at the end of the day. Tax reform is another one. Many Republicans that I know are really worried that Democrats, if they gain control of the Senate, will pursue a kind of tax reform, also a healthcare reform that will be very expensive to them personally. So these are the kinds of issues that voters vote on, not in foreign policy that tends to be much more remote. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that foreign policy isn't important. It will be tremendously important for the administration, and many of the issues that voters care about, economic issues, for example, will also in part be determined by things like trade policy and how the United States decides to deal with China going forward. So foreign policy is certainly important, but not something that drives people to the polls.
Thank you. Now, before we get to the prospects for the Biden administration, let's take a round here to look at the future of the GOP, the Republican Party. Is this the party of Trump for the foreseeable future? Or some people are already speculating that this is overstated, that once Trump is out of office, that the Republican Party will to some extent move on. Again, both sides are being argued. Let's begin with you, Professor Lammert. How do you see the future of the Republican Party beyond Trump or with Trump?
Well, the Republican Party, as well as the Democratic Party, are also deeply polarized and into different wings. And this was already obvious 4 years ago. And the successful election of Donald Trump covered a little bit up what is going wrong within the Republican Party. The problem right now for the Republican Party is that Trump took over. This was in the end just Trump's party. They were 100% loyal to what he did, and he delivered for them. He delivered tax cuts. He delivered Supreme Court judges and federal judges that are very conservative. And he will be, I guess this is the problem for the Republican Party, a powerful force in the future as well. Besides saying that he might have a second term, he already announced that he might run again in 24. And this is a problem for the Republican Party because it's hard for them to run against Donald Trump in the upcoming presidential election. Without the support of Donald Trump, the Republican Party in the next 4 years cannot be successful. And he's already collecting money for his re-election fund in order to run again. And this will be the decisive factor in the future of the Republican Party. Against Donald Trump, the party cannot develop.
Thank you. Let's turn to Klaus Shariat. You have many Republican friends, contacts in the US. What do you hear from them? What do you think is the future of this party beyond the Trump administration?
I think on that question, I think the jury is still out. I think it's too early to say what will happen. I just observe that what we saw in the last 3-4 years was unprecedented. For instance, in 2018, all those Republican candidates who were not favored by Trump had a difficult time, very often lost in the primaries, because Trump succeeded in first putting a lot of money against them, but also convinced voters that they should vote for somebody else. And then you have this year, a unique development, a unique in the last 60, 70 years. The Republican Party did not pass during their convention a platform, very first time. Usually all parties have 70, 80, 90-page platforms. The Republican Party just said, we support fully Donald Trump. That's unique. That the program of an American party is just one person. We didn't have that for a long time. And I think it's interesting that people like Lindsey Graham have totally turned around to Trump. Now we see the first slight developments maybe away from Donald Trump with Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader. But I think it's too early to say. I wouldn't say that the Republican Party has the power and the force to turn away fully from Donald Trump. I'm skeptical on that. I agree with Professor Lammert that he is already collecting money, and he has created a totally new base for the Republican Party. They never had many workers, white workers, blue-collar workers, and they suddenly do. And it would be very difficult for them to return to this old free trade, basically capitalist-minded Republican Party. It would be very, very difficult.
Ms. Bennhold, a Trumpist party, the Republican Party, for the foreseeable future?
So I don't really buy this idea of Trumpism. I feel like it really is just about him. And this idea that there is something like Trumpism, or that the party could be Trumpist beyond Trump, I'm not entirely sure. I'm not entirely sure how strategic he is. I don't think he's terribly ideological. It's all about him and its family. And I'm not sure that Trumpism as such is a thing. But I do agree that it looks like he has ambitions to run again, or that one of his clan has ambitions to run again in 2024, which would explain the ongoing sort of lies about the electoral result, because strategically, even if he himself doesn't believe that it was a fraudulent result, it may pave the way to keep that narrative flowing for 4 years or so. But I think, it's interesting. We've talked a lot about the economy. I do agree that the economy has been important in this election campaign. I think Trump would have won without COVID because of the economy, not so much because of the not because he handled the pandemic badly, but because the economy took a hit is why he lost. But I would say that actually there is culture matters too. And I think increasingly so. I mean, Trump's son, I can't remember which one, said something in 2016. I paraphrase, you know, my dad is just like a worker, just with a bigger bank account. And to me, that captures something very interesting. As you say, blue-collar workers didn't used to vote Republican. But now we have this phenomenon where very rich people and very poor people who economically have very little in common vote along the same lines. And this goes back to a situation where something that I mentioned early on, I think it is about this particular moment in history where America's moving from a majority white population to a majority minority population. And everything is now up for grabs. The whole story of the United States is up for grabs. It's about power. It's about what we call in German Deutungshoheit, about who gets to tell the story of the United States. What story do we tell about Thomas Jefferson? How much do we play up the fact that he owned slaves? How do we deal with Thanksgiving? It's a little awkward this year in particular, right? And so I feel like that is the story of the United States. And to me, you know, there are sort of two radically different outcomes possible here. I don't think it's necessarily all very difficult and tortuous. I mean, there's a sort of dystopian view, of course, that would see kind of this white supremacist backlash grow and lead to a situation where the Republican Party, which has in effect become a minority party, which is why they have no interest in reforming the Electoral College because it serves them right now. But, you know, it's a minority party. You know, if that backlash continues and is fed and comes back for whatever reason in 2024, then this could be dramatic because we could actually see the unraveling of American democracy, the unraveling of the mother of all democracies, a sort of illiberal democracy in the United States, and basically the West falling apart. That's the dystopian view. The utopian view, in a way, is, and this as a European who spent time in the United States, America has still, I would say, the most powerful story of all Western democracies to talk about diversity. It's the one place which has this sort of redemptive element in its story about a country of immigrants, a multi-ethnic society, multicultural society that sort of chips away at institutional inequalities and racism with this constitutional democracy. Now, it's not always working, but that story is very powerful. We don't have that story in Germany. We don't have that story in Europe. If that story is, you know, kind of told in the right way, and if Biden does a good job, then I think we could see a situation where, you know, having these diasporas of Chinese American, of Indian Americans, these diasporas could play a huge role in a world of a lot of democracies navigating the power games with China and other systems, you know, competing with other systems. These diasporas could actually become a huge asset. Anyhow, I feel like that is a really key point here.
I want us, because you already start mentioning Biden here, I want us to take this issue of the future of the Republican Party and the broader future of the US to now also consider what Biden is going to be up against, or what his agenda is going to be, what his challenges are going to be, to heal the nation, as he says. And I would say that that is true in two forms. Of course, the pandemic, in a public health sense, healing the nation, but also all the divisions that we have been talking about, all the cultural clashes and the economic gaps and so on that are out there. So the political culture needs a certain amount of healing, it almost would seem. What about the different domestic policy areas, social policy, healthcare policy? What about economic and trade policy? The rise of China was mentioned, and on it goes. Foreign and security policy, people in Europe saying, well, hopefully it goes back to the good old days with NATO and transatlantic buddiness, you know, and so on. Maybe we can start with the international dimension, the foreign policy dimension, and I turn to Professor Viola. How would you see the prospect here of the Biden administration? Challenges? Where is Biden going to set his particular accents? Are they familiar to us out of the past? Or is he going to deal with an environment that really now has definitively changed and is requiring something completely new? So the prospects now for the Biden administration.
Well, I think that interestingly, Biden has a leg in both camps, right? On the one hand, he has a lot of experience in foreign policy, and he has been around a long time. He knows many leaders. He has been on the world stage. And so he has a good grasp for sort of the good old days of transatlantic relations. On the other hand, he's certainly stepping into a foreign policy environment that is changed in significant ways. It's changed not only because of Trump and his policies, but also structural changes that have been going on. In any case, changes in domestic preferences, for example, vis-a-vis trade, but also changes in the structure of power relations at the international level. Also changes in the extent to which multilateralism, multilateral organizations are able to function in the global environment. So I think that he's facing a number of challenges. One of the things, however, in terms of healing or what's been called repair work, is that he will certainly emphasize, at least initially, a return to alliances, to partner building, to multilateralism. He said this already, that this will be an emphasis for him. He will certainly want to rebuild the State Department, which has been significantly gutted really in the last 4 years. And he will want to put a big emphasis on the diplomatic corps going out and trying to repair relations with other countries, but also with international organizations. So he said already that he will want to rejoin the Paris Accord. He will certainly want to rejoin the World Health Organization. He will try, but probably have a difficult time in trying to reform the WTO. And he has said that he has an interest under certain conditions to revive the nuclear deal with Iran. So it's a tall agenda, a tall order, and it's driven in part by a desire to return to a period of US global leadership as it was before Trump took office. But as I said, it's under very different conditions. So the prospects for him succeeding on any of these issues are still quite open. So, for example, the rift that has opened up between Europe and the United States regarding the security umbrella will stay, will remain. And Biden himself will certainly put NATO members under pressure to continue to increase their defense spending. He will certainly put Europe under pressure to take a harder line towards China and to toe the American line towards China, which Europe has been relatively reluctant to do. And Europe might have a harder time saying no to Biden than they did saying no to Trump. So I think that there will be tensions on that as well. And then, of course, Biden himself has been an internationalist and also a globalist, but he will be under pressure from his party to not pursue major free trade agreements, at least not without major regulatory components that reflect concerns in his party about the environment and labor standards. So on the one hand, I think he's a transition figure that is reassuring and will be reassuring to especially European partners, but he will be engaging in foreign policy in a world that has changed and that won't return to the way we knew it, at least in the 1990s.
Professor Steinhardt, let's look at the economic prospects in terms of socioeconomic policy. Biden presides over a party that has its own wings and divisions on this, more liberal, more left-wing oriented. If we think of people like Bernie Sanders, and then more moderate, perhaps even more conservative economic perspectives, what do you anticipate the Biden economic agenda and policy to be like, given these kinds of circumstances? Please.
Yes, I think everything depends on the political situation. So there's this upcoming election in Georgia, and this will decide whether you will have a majority in both chambers or not. And I think if he would have, so if Democrats are successful, then of course he has some room for political changes. And of course he mentioned in his agenda and his campaign already what he wants to change. So he has a very different view on taxes. So he wants a progressive tax system, or to make it more progressive. He wants a tax on capital gains and dividends, and he was very clear that he wants to have a policy for the middle class. He wants to make also the middle class more racially inclusive. He wants to invest in infrastructure. He wants a different environmental policy. So he wants to do something against the climate change. But I think it really depends on the political situation. But I want to come back to one important point, which was mentioned more than once here this evening, and this was the fact that we observe that blue-collar workers have started to to vote for the Republicans. Yeah? And we see this also in Europe. Blue-collar workers are voting for the Tories in the UK. Blue-collar workers are voting for Front National in France. And we see the same in Germany for the AfD. And I think this is the point which is very important also for, for understanding what's going on in the US and what's going on here in Europe, and also for the Biden administration. And we have done a colleague of mine from Munich, Pano Pudvara, and I have done some research on this, and we were trying to understand what is driving attitudes and worries about immigration and voting for the far right, okay? And in economic models, of course, there are many factors which play a role. So the skills of people are decisive for attitudes towards migration, whether the people have a job, whether the income of people, and we controlled for all this. But what we found in the paper is what we called bitterness. Bitterness we measure by a question, and the question is, do you agree to the following statement? Compared to other people, I have not achieved what I deserve. Okay, important is here compared to other people. I have not achieved what I deserve. Yeah, and we find that this is a very decisive factor. So people who have this feeling, they are much more likely to vote for the far right, for populist parties at the right side end of the distribution. And I think this holds. We never did it for the US. We are planning to do it for the US also. And I think, coming back to the question with Biden, I think Biden needs to implement policies for these people, right? People who think they belong to the losers of globalization. Many of these people definitely have lost, yeah, or have experienced declining wages or stagnating wages. But even those who have experienced a wage growth, so Lora Viola was mentioning that before the crisis hit the country, we saw a positive trend in wages for manufacturing in manufacturing sectors. But even those people might have a different perception, because it's not about the absolute growth, it's about the relative growth. So that people compare themselves to other people. People who are similar to them. And this is my answer to your question. So I think Biden needs to implement policies for the middle class, but also for people who feel that they have not achieved what they deserve, so who are embittered.
Dr. Shariat, your sense of the Biden administration, what would you expect or hope perhaps as well?
I would like to build on what just Mr. Steinhardt said, because I think you're right. I think the blue-collar people are key to the success of the Biden administration. When I traveled to the United States, when we had the financial crisis, I talked to many people, and I found out that we really have a difference in the United States in comparison to Europe, especially to Germany, that the losers of social change, and whenever you have social change, whenever you have globalization, the losers of social change are not really given an equivalent, given something to make up for it. For instance, I come from the Ruhr district, and in the 1960s, coal and steel was replaced by oil, and huge crisis. And then in Germany, the trade unions, the state government and the federal government got together, and they saw to it that those workers who had lost their jobs got not only recompensation, no, they got a new job, and a job of the same status. And when I traveled in the United States, I went to all 50 states during my stay, and I asked especially people who tended to vote for the Tea Party, I asked them, what is attractive about it? And they said, is especially that point. They thought they'd lost their dignity because they felt that the social change, which is unavoidable in a society, but it was not recompensated. They were not given the chance to get an equivalent job. For instance, I once talked to a steel worker. He had lost his job in a steel factory, and now worked at a McDonald's. And of course, it was not only the problem that he had less money, but he lost his dignity and his standing in the community. And that, I think, is the key. That's the key to right-wing party success. And that, I think, has to be attacked by Biden. That's my internal point, and that's absolutely key. On foreign policy, I very much agree with what you said, Professor Viola. I really agree that he will go back to multilateralism. He will go back to a world in which all those US institutions, built by the suggested by the United States, like the UN, like NATO, like the courts, they will play a role again. But I think two things are key. He will go back to find win-win solutions. The special trait of Donald Trump was that he did not believe in win-win. He believed in zero-sum games. He wanted to have a solution where he's the winner and the other must be the loser. He could not foresee that a solution which would be good for Germany could not be good for the United States because it was good for Germany. He was going for zero-sum games. And I think Joe Biden is a win-win person. That's the most drastic change, I think. The other change is, and I come back to what Professor Viola said, is that he will be tough on China, but in opposition to Donald Trump, he will not go it alone. He will turn to his allies, to the Europeans, and will say, let's do something against China. Because he will realize it can only be successful if Europe and North America work together. And the same is true on sanctions. We all had our problems with Iran, but in the end, we succeeded in concluding the nuclear deal when the Europeans and the United States got together. And now Donald Trump does exactly the opposite. He puts sanctions on everybody, not only on perceived fools, but also on allies. And he doesn't do it together with the Europeans. I mean, the sanctions we had, for instance, against Russia in the case of Crimea, they were sanctions discussed among Europeans and Americans, and they were agreed upon. And the same is true for Iran 2009, 2010, when we tried to get them back to the table. So the key difference will be, he will be tough on those issues, but he will try to find solutions which are good for all concerned and which are agreed upon among Europeans and Americans.
Thank you very much. I turn now again to Professor Lammert. A number of our audience members are also wondering to what extent the Biden policies, the Biden presidency will pursue policies that might prevent another Trump-type phenomenon from taking place. So let's imagine that Trump wants to run again in 2024. What would Biden have to do in the next 4 years to undercut the possibility of a Trump comeback? There's already been some indication as to the kinds of policies that would be important there. What is your perspective on that?
Oh yeah, that's a huge project that the Biden administration will have to deal with. I would just list what needs to be done in the United States. Massive investments in infrastructure. I guess there it's possible to find maybe bipartisan support. We need a new approach in climate change, massive investment in renewable energies. This is some kind of transformation of the whole economy. This is a huge job. Immigration reform, this is something that US presidents have tried since George W. Bush and never accomplished. Very important criminal justice reform dealing with structural racism in the United States. This is especially important to get the support from minority groups. And healthcare reform. This is very high on the agenda. The Trump administration tried again and again to repeal Obamacare without success, but there is still a crisis of getting access to healthcare and also the development of costs in the healthcare sector. So that's the broad range of reform initiatives the Biden administration has to tackle. And in order to get this done, Biden needs Congress. And that means he needs to find bipartisan coalition for all of these huge reform projects. And I guess he is the politician who can maybe succeed with building bipartisan coalition, because he had already done this in Congress, and he knows a lot of senators and also the heads of both political parties. And he has to deal with his own progressive wing, because they want drastic change. They want massive economic reform in order to fight climate change. And this is a balance that he needs to find, getting support from Republicans without losing the progressive wing of the party, and appealing to the progressive wing of his party without losing contact to Republican politicians and voters.
Thank you. I now want to turn to Ms. Bennhold also with this question. A number of our audience members are also wondering about the role of the media in all this. When Biden is going to pursue an agenda, for example, of healing the divisions of the country, as he has suggested he wants to do, how do you see this Biden presidency shaping up, and what role might the media play in support of efforts to heal the divisions in the country?
I think you should ask this question to Mark Zuckerberg. I mean, I think the key question here is the kind of responsibility of the social media platforms. I don't think there is a single more important factor in sort of determining how the polarization and the healing, well, how the polarization can be healed from the side of the media. I mean, I was sort of impressed, but I think, I was impressed by how Twitter, for example, leading up to the election, has been very good at labeling even the president's tweet as being either disinformation or unconfirmed information. I mean, they did that 3 minutes before the election. I wish they'd started 6 months before. I think the fact that Mark Zuckerberg still justifies not banning Steve Bannon from the platform because there isn't enough evidence that, you know, he contravenes guidelines, even though he's called for Fauci to be beheaded. That's the kind of thing where I feel, you know, that's what we're up against. And when you have social media platforms whose business model actually favors disinformation and corrosive information, disinformation, then, you know, democracy has a problem. I just want to throw back to 2016 when "Build That Wall" was a major slogan, and as we all know, became very popular. And in fact, it's been one of the things that people measure Trump's kind of delivery on promises against. That slogan was tested by Cambridge Analytica. That is not an organic slogan. That is a fake slogan that was tested. It proved to be popular. It was used. It is a perfect example of how disinformation can actually bring down democracy. So if you're asking me about the role of the media going forward, personally, I think the main work that needs to be done is in social media companies. And if they don't do it by themselves, I mean, I would hope that a Biden administration kind of puts on the thumb screws there and maybe takes a cue from Europe, because frankly, I think Europe has been much stronger on that front.
Thank you very much. We have run out of time. This could go on and could go on. I have a lot more questions, and I know our audience has a lot more questions. I've tried to pack some of them together that dealt with the implications of the media and of the challenges that Biden faces. There's a lot more to cover, but unfortunately, we just don't have time in the 1.5 hours that we have for this. But this has been tremendous. I really want to thank our 5 panelists for all their insights that they've shared. We, I think, have covered a lot of ground. I also want to thank our audience for many of the comments also that have been contributed. I think we can make sure also that the panelists get access to the questions and comments so you can look through them and see to what extent some of your own contributions generated and triggered certain comments in the course of the event. I want to indicate to our audience that we are going to be online again on December 17th with the next installment of our Berlin Talks. The topic at that point, at that time, on that day, will be migration in Berlin, Germany, and Europe, challenges and prospects before, during, and after Corona, after the pandemic. So the whole interaction between the migration dynamic as an issue and the pandemic will be the focus on December 17th. Once again, this event has been recorded. It will be posted on our YouTube channel. On behalf of the FUBiS program and the FUBiS program, on behalf of Freie Universität Berlin, I thank you, the audience. I thank the panelists for having been part of this. I wish you good health, and we'll see you and have you participate again in December. Thank you and good night.